The M3 Lee arrived on the battlefield not with fanfare, but with necessity. It was 1941, and the war in North Africa had taken a grim turn for the Allies. The German Afrika Korps, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, had quickly proven their supremacy in armor with the Panzer III and IV, backed by fast-moving forces that outclassed the British tanks they faced. The British Crusader and Matilda, though tough, were not enough to turn the tide. Worse yet, the Americans, still in the process of ramping up production and not yet deeply involved in the fight, faced a serious dilemma. They didn't have the tanks they needed to compete. The Sherman was still in development, and the heavy tanks required to match the German panzers, machines with thick armor and powerful guns, seemed a distant dream. That's when the M3 Lee emerged. The M3 Lee was an oddity in the world of tank design, a compromise between necessity and ingenuity. Designed by the U.S. Ordnance Department, it was hastily created in response to the desperate need for armored support during the early months of American entry into World War II. The Lee was not a tank that would become a legend in the traditional sense. It was cumbersome, with its turret mounted off-center, leaving the 75mm main gun in a fixed position rather than a fully rotating turret. It could fire high-explosive shells, but it lacked the ability to fully engage German tanks with its main weapon alone. It carried a secondary 37mm gun, which would prove useless against the armor of the panzers. Its armor was thinner than that of its German counterparts, especially in the crucial areas of the hull, and its distinctive tall profile made it an easy target for German anti-tank gunners. Yet, despite these apparent shortcomings, the M3 Lee became the tank that filled the gap at a time when there was little else to rely on. Its delivery to the battlefield was a stroke of necessity rather than strategy, filling a crucial gap in the Allied armored units that were stretched thin. As it landed in North Africa in late 1941, American tankers greeted it with a mixture of wariness and hope. They knew it wasn't perfect, but they also knew that anything with a gun mounted on it, with armor thick enough to withstand some hits, and the ability to take the fight to Rommel's forces, was a welcome addition to the fight. American tankers in North Africa had already faced the harsh reality of tank warfare, encountering the fearsome German panzers, whose 75mm guns and sloped armor made short work of the Shermans they had available at the time. The M3 Lee arrived as a stopgap. It wasn't meant to be a game-changer. It wasn't designed to be a masterpiece of tank design. But it would prove to be something more important in the brutal desert campaign. It would prove to be an unexpected hero. While the design was less than ideal, the M3 Lee's ability to take punishment and keep moving in a way no other tank had been able to was a revelation. The M3 Lee's first real trial came in the sands of North Africa, where Allied forces were locked in a brutal struggle to prevent Rommel's forces from sweeping across Egypt and reaching the vital Suez Canal. In the hellish environment of the desert, the M3 Lee, with its heavier armament and slightly more durable armor compared to the lighter tanks it replaced, quickly proved itself a more reliable presence. As the dust settled after its first encounters with the Germans, tankers found themselves stunned. For all its flaws, the M3 Lee was more resilient than they had anticipated. It could withstand hits from German 50mm and 75mm guns, hits that would have shredded a lighter tank. In a tank battle where every inch of armor mattered, the Lee held on longer than anyone had expected. It became evident that while the M3 Lee was far from perfect, it was tougher than expected, and toughness could sometimes win the day. Reports from the front soon trickled back to Allied command. The M3 Lee can take hits and keep fighting. In the thick of the North African desert, where the terrain itself was a harsh enemy, the M3 Lee's resilience became its defining feature. When other tanks would have been knocked out of action, either by gunfire or mechanical failure, M3 Lee tanks stayed in the fight, firing back. Several accounts from tankers detailed moments when their M3 Lee tanks, after being hit multiple times by German fire, were still able to keep moving, advancing, and taking on new targets. One particular story became legendary. A single M3 Lee, after receiving a hit from a German 50mm gun that shattered its tracks, was still able to limp back to Allied lines under its own power, all the while engaging enemy infantry and machine gunners that had attempted to overrun the tank. The crews quickly realized that M3 Lee's ability to keep moving under fire gave it an edge in combat situations. It wasn't as fast or maneuverable as the Germans' more advanced models, but when a tank could survive hit after hit and keep firing, it became a force to be reckoned with. Allied tankers found that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the M3 Lee's ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting helped bolster morale. It wasn't glamorous or heroic, it was gritty and raw, much like the desert itself. Yet it worked. As the war dragged on and the Allies pressed forward through North Africa, the M3 Lee remained a stubborn pillar in the desert battlefields. The tank's toughness became a symbol of persistence. For many tank crews, it was a reminder that even when the odds were stacked against them, the fight wasn't over until the tank stopped moving. And the M3 Lee had a remarkable way of keeping moving, no matter how many times it was hit. In the end, the M3 Lee's real strength was not in its design or its firepower, but in its ability to endure in the most unforgiving conditions. This tank, built with compromises, ultimately turned out to be a lesson in the power of resilience. Its toughness would lay the foundation for the future of American tank warfare, showing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from technological superiority, but from the ability to stand tall in the face of adversity. For the men who fought in M3 Lees, it was a reminder that in war, staying in the fight could be the most important victory of all. The M3 Lee was not the tank America wanted, but it was exactly the tank America needed at the time, and in that, it became an unexpected hero of the war.
The first time the M3 Lee rolled into battle under fire, no one, not the Germans, not the British, not even the American crews sitting inside it, was truly prepared for what would happen. North Africa in early 1942 was a place where reputations were made and destroyed in a matter of minutes. The desert could turn a tank into a furnace, a crewman into a ghost, and the inexperienced into casualties before they had even fired a shot. And into this crucible came the M3 Lee, tall, awkward, under-armored, and carrying a design philosophy that seemed almost antique compared to the sleek, killing machine efficiency of the German panzers. Nobody expected much. Some expected failure. A few expected catastrophe. What they got instead was surprise. Violent, metallic, unforgettable surprise. The first real test came near Gazala, where Rommel had been maneuvering aggressively, smashing British lines with fast panzer thrusts, supported by deadly 50mm anti-tank guns. The Afrika Korps had grown used to Allied tanks that burst into flames after one or two hits. They expected the same from the new American machines arriving in British service. From a distance, the M3 Lee's silhouette was unmistakable, a towering structure with multiple guns jutting out from different angles. German gunners reportedly laughed when they first saw it through their optics, calling it a metal barn on tracks. To them, the tall profile meant one thing: an easy kill. But when the German 50mm shells began to hit, something unexpected happened. The M3 Lee did not die. Shells struck the front glacis, sending sparks and bursts of sand into the air. The first round dented the armor. The second cracked a weld seam. The third punched through an external stowage box but failed to breach the crew compartment. Inside, the American crew braced for the worst, expecting the vehicle to erupt into flames. But the tank kept moving, its engine roaring as if refusing to die. Then the 75mm sponson gun spoke. Its blast echoed across the dunes, sending a high-explosive shell slamming into a German gun pit. Sand and metal flew into the air. The German crew dove for cover. The M3 Lee was still alive, and it was angry. As the tank rumbled forward, the turret-mounted 37mm gun joined the fight, firing on infantry positions scrambling between dunes. The dual-gun setup, awkward on paper, suddenly made sense on the battlefield. The 75mm suppressed enemy anti-tank guns, while the 37mm picked off softer targets. German forward observers radioed in disbelief. The tall American tank, it continues to advance despite multiple hits. For the first time in months, Rommel's gunners were forced to reload frantically, recalibrate their sights, and double-check their range. They had underestimated the M3 Lee's resilience, a mistake that would cost them dearly. One engagement around Bir Hakeim became legendary in after-action reports. A formation of M3 Lees, accompanied by British Grant variants, advanced across open ground to support isolated infantry units. The Germans opened fire with a mix of 50mm pack guns and long-barreled Panzer III tanks. Shells hammered the American tanks. Several Lees took direct hits, cracked armor plates, shattered periscopes, disabled track links. In any other tank of the era, this would have been the end. But the M3 Lee crews refused to bail out. They kept driving, kept firing, kept pushing forward. And then the unexpected happened. One immobilized Lee, still able to rotate its turret, continued firing for nearly 20 minutes, forcing a German anti-tank crew to abandon their gun and retreat. Later, when infantry inspected the battlefield, they found the Lee had taken 7 hits, 7 from German 50mm cannons, and had never lost turret rotation. The sponson gun remained intact. The engine compartment was damaged but not destroyed. One crewman later wrote, "We thought we were dead 3 times that day. The Lee decided otherwise." Stories like this spread quickly through the ranks. Crews who had once joked about the tank's ungainly appearance now spoke about its surprising toughness. German troops, too, grew cautious. Some called the Lee Der Stamme Ami, the stubborn American. Its impact was not limited to duels with anti-tank guns. During the chaotic fighting around Knightsbridge, several M3 Lees supported a British armored brigade under heavy attack. A German Panzer III scored multiple hits on one of the Lees, cracking open the hull around the driver's port. The crew was shaken, but unhurt. Instead of retreating, the Lee returned fire with its 75mm, striking the Panzer at an angle that tore through its side armor. The German tank erupted in flames. Nearby crews watched in shock. A tank that looked like a factory mistake had just beaten a seasoned Panzer III in a head-to-head shootout. This was the moment soldiers began to understand a truth that wasn't written in any manual. The M3 Lee was tougher than it looked. It did not win battles through elegance or superior engineering. It won through stubbornness, through armor that held together long enough for crews to get off the shot that mattered, through redundant systems that allowed it to fight even when damaged, through pure mechanical will. It was not the tank the Americans had dreamed of sending to war, but it was the one that arrived when the Allies needed something, anything, that could stand against the Afrika Korps. By the end of its first major engagements, skepticism had turned into respect. The M3 Lee was not perfect. It was not even great. But in those desperate early battles in North Africa, when the balance of power was fragile and the future uncertain, the M3 Lee proved one thing beyond doubt. It could take hits, far more than anyone had expected, and it could keep fighting.
The desert was a cruel judge of machines. It punished every weakness. Overheating engines, clogged air filters, fragile gearboxes, brittle weld seams, until only the toughest remained. And in that furnace of sand and steel, the M3 Lee revealed a hidden strength no blueprint or training manual had ever mentioned. It was a survivor. Not elegant, not fearsome, not technologically superior, just stubbornly, infuriatingly hard to kill. American and British crews who had once rolled their eyes at the Lee's clumsy silhouette soon found themselves relying on it in ways they had never imagined. If the Sherman was a well-balanced contender, and the Tiger a deadly predator, then the M3 Lee was something closer to a bulldog. Stocky, bruised, scarred, but always getting back up for another round. One of the earliest confirmations of the Lee's resilience came during the tangled battles near Gazala in mid-1942, where Allied forces found themselves outmaneuvered by Rommel's Afrika Korps. In the chaos, a platoon of M3 Lees from the U.S. 1st Armored Division was tasked with reinforcing a crumbling infantry line. As the Lees advanced, they immediately drew fire from a ridge held by German PaK-38 crews. The 50mm guns opened up at once, sending a chain of armor-piercing rounds straight into the column. The first Lee took a hit on the upper hull. Armor buckled but didn't break. The second was struck on the turret ring, jamming the rotation, but leaving the 75mm gun fully operational. The third, hit twice in rapid succession, lost its radio but retained full mobility. The line should have shattered. Instead, the Lees kept advancing like wounded animals refusing to die. German gun crews used to seeing British Crusaders explode after 2 or 3 hits were stunned. They adjusted their sights, fired again, and watched in frustration as the Lees replied with 75mm blasts that forced them to scramble for cover. Later, when engineers inspected the surviving tanks, they found something remarkable. Several armor plates were bent inward like crushed tin, but the structural frame remained intact. "It looked like a fist had punched the hull," said one mechanic, "but the damn thing still ran." This became the unofficial description of the M3 Lee, punched but running. Even more astonishing were the accounts from crews who experienced catastrophic-sounding hits but stayed in the fight anyway. In one engagement near El Adam, a Lee commander reported hearing a massive crack as a German round struck the sponson armor beside the 75mm gun. Dust filled the fighting compartment. Rivets flew like shrapnel. The gun shield dented inward. The loader briefly thought they were dead. But when the smoke cleared, the gun still traversed, the breech still locked, and the firing mechanism still worked. Shaking off the shock, the crew loaded another shell and fired. According to infantry who witnessed the duel, the battered Lee looked like it should have fallen apart, but instead it barked back like a wounded dog. Stories like these spread quickly across North Africa. Tankers are superstitious by nature, and soon crews began referring to certain Lees as lucky hulls, machines that seemed to absorb impossible punishment. One particular tank, nicknamed Old Salt, survived 9 confirmed hits over 3 engagements. On one occasion, after taking a direct shot that blew open a side access panel, the crew simply welded a spare toolbox over the gap and returned to battle 2 hours later. The Germans hit it again days later, this time shattering the commander's cupola. The crew replaced it with a salvaged hatch from a wrecked British Grant and kept fighting. Old Salt was eventually retired due to transmission failure, not enemy fire. Its hull, now scarred like an ancient warrior shield, became a minor legend in the division. Part of the M3 Lee's resilience lay in its strange design. What engineers saw as flaws, multiple compartments, redundant guns, dispersed crew positions, turned out to provide unexpected survival benefits. A hit that disabled the 37mm turret gun often left the 75mm sponson gun untouched. A breach on the right side of the hull might injure the radio operator, but leave the driver and gun crew still fully functional. Even mobility kills were sometimes temporary. The Lee's simple suspension and accessible track components allowed mechanics to perform miracles under fire. One field repair team near Mersa Matruh replaced a broken bogie wheel in under 30 minutes while shells exploded in the distance. The tank was back in the fight before the smoke settled. American crews quickly learned field expediency. They packed sandbags along the hull. They welded spare track sections across the front glacis. They reinforced weak points with boxes, canisters, and scrap metal. The Lee, more than any other tank of the early war, became a rolling laboratory for improvisation. And because its structure was forgiving, these additions actually worked. A Lee crew from the 13th Armored Regiment once credited 2 layers of spare track links with stopping a German round that would have penetrated the driver's port. "We survived because we carried our junk," the driver joked. But the truth was more profound. The M3 Lee invited creativity because it could accommodate it. Morale also changed. Tankers who had once feared the desert's open killing fields now had something they could trust, not to protect them completely, but to give them a fighting chance. A machine that didn't explode after the first hit, that didn't cripple after the second, that didn't surrender its crew after the third. This mattered more than technology. It gave them time. Time to fire back, time to maneuver, time to escape, time to live. German reports captured after the war confirmed what Allied crews already knew. Panzer commanders wrote with irritation that, quote, "the American Lee tank does not fall to normal fire as expected," end quote. One Africa Corps officer complained that Lees behave like damaged trucks, still moving after serious hits. It wasn't meant as a compliment, but it might as well have been. By late 1942, the M3 Lee had earned a strange and unexpected reputation. The tank that shouldn't work, but does. The tank that shouldn't survive, but keeps surviving. The tank that soldiers mocked when they first saw it, but trusted when the shells started falling. It was flawed, awkward, outdated by 1943 standards, but in those critical early months in North Africa, the M3 Lee did what mattered most. It stayed in the fight, every time.
If the M3 Lee had one true superpower, it wasn't its guns, its armor, or its engine. It was the fact that it refused to die, and even more incredibly, that it could be resurrected right there on the battlefield. In North Africa, where logistics were stretched thin and battle lines moved constantly, a tank that could be brought back from the brink in minutes, not days, was worth its weight in gold. And the M3 Lee, with its boxy hull and straightforward mechanical layout, became the most repairable tank in the desert. What it lacked in elegance, it made up for in practicality. Its very simplicity turned into a battlefield advantage that no one foresaw. To understand why this mattered, one must understand the brutal arithmetic of desert warfare. Every tank lost wasn't simply a machine gone. It meant a weakened line, a vulnerable flank, a crew walking back across burning sand under enemy fire. And the Africa Corps, with their disciplined gun crews and precise tactics, made sure that every hit counted. Allied tankers quickly realized that bringing a damaged Lee back into action, even if it looked like a twisted metal monster, could be the difference between holding a ridge and losing an entire battalion. Field repairs became almost a ritual. Scenes of mechanics working under the blistering sun became part of daily life. Sparks from welding torches cutting through the desert heat, men hammering on bent plates, crews tightening bolts with hands still shaking from battle. And the Lee, unlike many other tanks, seemed designed to tolerate this rough treatment. Its internal layout, though criticized by engineers back home, gave crews access to most essential components without needing to dismantle half the tank. Where a British Crusader required workshop-level disassembly to reach its transmission, the Lee allowed mechanics to lift panels and get straight to work. One of the most remarkable examples came from the fighting near Sidi Rezeg.
A Lee took 3 hits in quick succession. One blew apart its right side track links, another shattered the sponson plate around the 75mm gun, and the last tore open a storage box, scattering ammunition across the sand. By all accounts, that should have been the end of it, but the crew didn't abandon the tank. They radioed back, held their position with the 37mm turret gun, and waited. Within an hour, under fire, American and British repair teams dragged replacement track links through the sand, jacked the tank up, and began bolting the new parts on. The crew climbed out, covered in sweat and soot, helping push the track into place. Shells whistled overhead, shrapnel kicked up sand, yet 20 minutes later, the Lee lurched forward again. Scarred, patched up, but very much alive. Stories like that traveled fast. They became almost mythic, told and retold in mess tents, replacing early jokes about the M3's ugly silhouette with something closer to respect. Mechanics began to compete to see how fast they could turn a wrecked Lee back into a fighting machine. Some teams could swap out a road wheel in under 15 minutes. Others welded entire armor panels scavenged from wrecked vehicles onto surviving Lees, turning them into bizarre but effective hybrids. There was even an incident where a Lee, having lost its 37mm turret to a direct hit, had the open turret hole covered with a steel sheet and returned to combat, its crew fighting on with only the 75mm gun and their machine guns. They nicknamed it the One-Eyed Mule, and it continued serving for weeks. The Germans noticed. Reports from Afrika Korps units noted with irritation that American tanks reappeared shortly after being disabled, often patched together with field-made armor plates of crude but effective nature. German officers prided themselves on precision engineering, everything built to exact tolerances. But in the desert, this became a liability. Their tanks needed specialized parts, specialist teams, and carefully maintained supply lines. A broken idler wheel or damaged transmission could sideline a panzer for days. The Lee, by contrast, was an open invitation. Rip out the broken part, hammer the bent piece, weld what you can, bolt the rest, and drive. This resilience created a new kind of psychological impact. Tank crews began to trust their machines, not because the M3 Lee was safe, but because it wouldn't abandon them easily. One American gunner said it best: a Lee didn't quit. If the engine still coughed and the gun still barked, she was good to go. And that mattered. At a time when the Allies were still learning armored warfare and still adjusting to German tactics, confidence was a precious resource. Confidence in a tank that could return from the dead was priceless. Perhaps the most dramatic example of battlefield resurrection came during Operation Crusader. A Lee took a hit that tore open the sponson around the 75mm, blasting molten metal into the gun housing and seizing the recoil mechanism. The crew bailed out, believing the tank finished, but when British engineers arrived, they saw the hull was still structurally sound. They replaced the damaged recoil system with parts scavenged from 2 different wrecked Lees, hammered the gun mount straight with sledgehammers, and patched the breech housing with a steel plate from a disabled Grant tank, and had the Lee operational again in 6 hours. When the original crew returned, still shaken from the battle, they found their tank waiting for them, smoking, dented, but ready. One crewman swore the tank looked embarrassed to ever have quit. This ability to resurrect itself through both design and sheer stubbornness made the M3 Lee far more valuable than expected. In North Africa, the war was not just about firepower or accuracy, it was about endurance. It was about staying in the fight when every mile mattered, when every tank mattered, and when reinforcements were weeks away across the Atlantic. The Lee, flawed though it was, became a symbol of that endurance. It showed that a tank didn't need to be perfect to matter. It needed to be present, moving, firing, and surviving. And the M3 Lee excelled at all 4. By late 1942, Allied tank brigades had learned a crucial lesson. A tank that could be repaired on the battlefield was worth 3 that couldn't. The M3 Lee, ungainly and outdated though it appeared, had earned its place in the desert, not through brilliance, but through persistence. And in war, persistence is often the most powerful weapon of all.
The M3 Lee's story did not end in the desert, nor did its legacy fade when the last shell was fired across the dunes of North Africa. In fact, the strangest truth about the M3 Lee is this. The tank that looked obsolete the moment it arrived, ungainly, tall, cluttered with multiple guns, became one of the most important stepping stones in the evolution of American armor. It was not the perfect machine. It was not the iconic Sherman. It was not the feared Tiger or Panther. But the M3 Lee was the tank that held the line when there was nothing else to hold it. And because of that, it became the bridge between an unprepared America and an armored giant ready to shape the rest of the war and the rest of the century. When the fighting in North Africa ended and the Allies turned their attention to Italy, the M3 Lee gradually faded from frontline service. It was replaced by the M4 Sherman, a tank that embodied everything the Lee had taught American engineers: a turreted 75mm gun, a lower silhouette, better internal space, more robust components, and easier long-term maintenance. But the Sherman would never have existed in time if the Lee hadn't filled the gap. The Lee bought the U.S. Army months, critical, irreplaceable months, when armored divisions desperately needed firepower on the ground. Every engagement the Lee survived, every shot it fired, every hit it absorbed, proved something essential. The Americans could build tanks that worked, tanks that could fight, tanks that could evolve. This evolution wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Before North Africa, the American Army didn't truly understand tank warfare. Their doctrine was scattered, outdated, and rooted in pre-war theory. But the Lee forced them to learn. It forced tanker crews to adapt to real combat conditions. It forced maintenance teams to develop rapid repair procedures that later became standard for the Sherman and beyond. It forced commanders to understand the importance of combined arms, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support working together instead of in isolation. In this way, the ungainly Lee shaped not only machines but men, crews who would later lead armored assaults in Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany. The British, too, learned from the Lee. Their Grant version, modified with a different turret, became a vital tank during the turning point battles at El Alamein. British crews respected the Lee's firepower and resilience more than they admitted publicly. In after-action reports, many British commanders noted that the American Grant played a decisive role in halting German armor. This was no small praise from an army that prized engineering excellence. Yet the Lee earned it through grit, not grace. Even the Germans, who mocked the Lee's profile and called it a towering silhouette, acknowledged its contribution. Captured Africa Corps documents mention the M3 as unexpectedly durable and difficult to neutralize except with larger guns. The German nickname for the Lee, der verfluchte Hauspanzer, the accursed house tank, reflected not amusement, but frustration. They had underestimated it, and it had cost them time, equipment, and in certain battles, their momentum. After North Africa, the Lee found new life elsewhere. In Burma, Indian and British forces used the tank against Japanese positions, leveraging its powerful 75mm gun to smash bunkers hidden in jungles too thick for other vehicles. The Japanese, who had even lighter tanks than the Germans, were often powerless against the Lee's firepower. To them, the Lee was not a flawed design, it was a monster. In some battles, it turned the tide entirely, especially in engagements where infantry had struggled for weeks to dislodge entrenched Japanese defenders. The Lee's legacy stretched further than most people realize. But its greatest legacy was not on any battlefield. It was in every American tank that followed. The M3 Lee taught American engineers that armor thickness mattered more than theory, that firepower had to be flexible, that redundancy saved lives, and that field repairability was as vital as manufacturing precision. The Sherman inherited the Lee's engineering lessons. The Pershing inherited its combat lessons, and the Cold War Pattons inherited its spirit. The spirit of a tank that wasn't pretty, wasn't perfect, but fought like hell and refused to die. The Lee also taught tank crews something personal.
that survival sometimes depended on stubbornness as much as steel. Veterans who once cursed the tank for being tall and awkward later remembered it with reluctant fondness. They remembered the moments when the Lee took a hit that should have killed them, but didn't. They remembered the frantic repairs in the desert sun that brought the tank back to life. They remembered the feeling of the engine growling beneath their feet, still alive after a blast that should have stopped it cold. Many Sherman and Pershing crews later said the same thing. If a Lee could survive that, we could survive anything. When the fighting ended in North Africa, the M3 Lee faded quietly into scrapyards and training depots. It never received parades or statues, it never starred in Hollywood films, it never became the symbol of victory. But perhaps that's fitting. The M3 Lee's greatness was never loud, it was never glamorous. It was the greatness of endurance, of showing up when needed, of fighting with what you had, of standing firm when everything else fell apart. The M3 Lee was not the tank that won World War II. It was the tank that kept the Allies in the fight long enough to win it later. Its armor was flawed, its guns were awkward, its silhouette was a liability. But when shells flew and the desert burned, the Lee proved one simple truth. Greatness isn't always about perfection. Sometimes, greatness is just about refusing to quit.